It's important to know where, stuff, how you're going to cast that piece. Like most likely, whoever does end up casting this, because I can't, I'll end up cutting that hand off, and then they'll just cast that separately. So now that I smoothed out that area and I kind of have it where I want it to be, I go in and I add little tiny icicles, I guess. I don't know what they're called. Strips of hair, right? And I just press them on kind of loosely because I'm going to reform them. They just make little triangles here and there. This then gets blended into those clumps of fur. So you've got hills and valleys, which your hair does. And it also catches the light and makes it so that when you paint it, there are low, darker areas and then highlighted areas too. So doing these little sharpened strands and laying them on there is how you start to get your hair formation or your fur. So I'm just doing a few here and there, and I'm going over even the areas where I've started to do the detailing, because this is how you get an interesting shape. So well, too, if you're watching, hi. So yeah, today is just gonna hopefully filling in all these little extra areas. All right, so I just made all those little tendrils there. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure that I'm probably going to keep under the chin the way that it is, so it does dip in and then come back out where his collarbone is. There's a roll of fat directly under his neck that I want that to stay prominent, and so it has this kind of bump and then goes down into his collarbone area, down in here. Get a smaller tool, and then back up and over this bulk of fur. This is all little stuff that, as a sculptor, you tend to look at. I mean, no matter what I'm designing, the silhouette is very important. So with a sculpture like this, it needs to look, obviously, interesting from any angle. But again, my point with this is that if it were sitting on a table or on a shelf, when you walk by it, you kind of get that sneer as you pass by, and you've got the movement of the fur, almost like the wind is blowing, like he's standing on the cliff of Mount Crumpet, and just the wind's blowing, and he's got his idea. So, telling a story with the body movement and the pose and everything else is very important. I mean, it's the same with when I'm doing a drawing. The little details and the silhouette are so important to start with. So I knew with this, when I did the under structure of the armature, that it was very crooked, it was very angular, to give that, I think, a little more sinister feeling. So all this in there has to be detailed too, but I think for the most part, the structure of how that looks under his neck is where I want it to be. And then I will go in and detail all of this fur in here. Just making sure all the gaps are filled in and all of the areas are smoothed where they need to be. And if I have to put any more strands in, that I do it now before I start going into this. Like that area needs more clumpy. So let's get that in there too. That's again, the hard part with this is such a weird, there's not a lot of room to work at this point because of where his hands are and stuff. And had I known I was going to do more, thank you, Eric. Had I known I was going to do more extra work to this to cast it, then I probably would have filled in all of this stuff before I even got there. I was really just kind of doing this for fun, and then decided to make it a casting. So I don't know. It's coming along. But I definitely there's still a bunch of areas underneath those arms, the way they're folded, that I want it to look correct in that, the bulk of it is there and it looks like it's purposeful and not just filled in to make him look fat. Or it will look like he's fat, as opposed to just, this is bulk and this is filler. Even though you don't look at it, you never know which angle. If somebody picked this up and looked at it and looked under it, you'd see all that area under there. And if it looks unfinished or odd, it throws off the sculpture. So, at least to me, I look at things like that. If I get a good sculpture and I can move it around and look at it and see all the little details, that just makes it that much better. So, but I'm mental that way. Anyway, so most of it is filled in the way that it needs to. I work on this at night too, and my lighting in my studio is not that great. So I find myself the next days looking at something and saying, oh, that is not right at all. That's not filled in at all. And it's frustrating. Anywho. Luckily, I've got all these wonderful tools to help me get to all these hard-to-reach places. It's like I'm doing reverse surgery and taking these tiny little utensils and tools and filling in, putting parts back in that should be there. That's the hard part is that I keep touching the sculpture as I go, which I admit that my brain being where it is right now is not paying attention to. And I kind of go in and wreck my own work. I mean, I know I'm touching it very lightly right now. If this, like I was saying, if I knew I was going to be doing this much work into it, I would have built a different armature. And that is, having an armature that has a support piece going through inside the back area of it and coming up from the table. That would help immensely. That way I don't have to touch the sculpture at all to make sure that it's where it needs to be. But as you can see, even when I touch this a little bit, it wobbles. And that's because it's on the wrong kind of base. So, my fault. So it just makes it more challenging, I guess, to sculpt it. But eventually, hopefully by the end of the day, not only will I have all these little tufts of fur done, and but I'll also have all this filled in correctly, so I can move on to the next step. So, where was I? Let's finish one thought at a time. I'll go back to this on this back here. So I just added in all these extra pieces just to kind of make this flow a little bit better from the back of his head into his neck into his back. So I've added a few extra tendrils here and there, and they're just going to get pressed down and curved a bit. Some of them overlay each other. This is what I've been doing for this whole statue. So this is starting from scratch in this area again with just a smooth area and then adding in the tendrils. So I add in those tendrils the way that they are, and I press them in towards the back of it so that they are actually connected and don't fall off first before I start blending. So I just kind of press them in at the ends. All right, I'm not really blending it, I'm just pushing it into the clay that's under it. I will start blending it a bit. So just kind of stay with the curve of it. Again, you're making like a hill and a valley with it. But I'm also just securing it down at this point. All those weeks of doing the tool challenge that I was doing has definitely helped with knowing what my tools can do and which tools are better at using for different things. So hair is not something, or fur is not something I sculpt all that much because I kind of hate it. But so I'm definitely not as proficient as other people are with it, but I'm trying my best. There's so many levels to doing fur and hair correctly to make it look natural. And there's some people out there that are just like really, really good at it. I am mediocre at best. You'll notice most of my sculptures, even if there is hair and fur, it's very angular and very simple. So that's totally on purpose. All right, so those are all kind of pressed in. So I was just using a flat kind of spatula for that. The other end of this is what I've been doing most of my hair work with, which is it's curved. And these are fun little stainless steel tools. The stainless steel tools do not stick to the Cosclay. So now with that tool, with the rounded edge of that tool, I kind of go in and push and pull to blend the hair that's already above it into the hair below. And I'm still not making individual strands. I'm just curving that patch of fur, because again, it's not strands that you're trying to create. It's patches of, I'm going to move over a little bit so you can see it better. It's areas of hair and fur that you're building, not individual strands. That comes later. So right now I'm just kind of pushing the clay into a little bit of a curve here and there, but really just kind of blending it in on itself while still keeping the sharpness of the area, I guess. You know, there's some areas that I already had built up earlier that will now make their own strands. Or not strands, but areas. Bulk. So all these little tendrils were just added today. And again, I wanted to add a nice flow from the back of his head into, I'm going to turn this, I can't do that from that angle. From the back of his head into his collar and shoulders. I want it to look like the fur is kind of cascading off of him. You know, the coloring of the fur will be different around his neck. So that will be, you know, similar to the cartoon, I guess, that he had kind of a tuft of hair around his neck. And I continued that on with his hands as well. So there's a thick matted area around his wrists and around his neck. And if you saw his feet, it would probably be there too. And those will be a little bit, I don't know, darker or lighter in color. I haven't figured out his coloring yet. But not such a significant change like a French poodle, which is kind of how, you know, it is like the Grinch in the cartoon. It kind of has this collar of fur, like Kermit the Frog's little webbed piece. And although I like that in the cartoon, it didn't look as natural. So I'm kind of just doing my own thing. Hi, Noel. So now all those tendrils are being blended into their own little areas. Here. I hear the Brady Bunch song playing and I don't know why. If you hear it too, I don't know why. I hope it's not just me and my space madness. Alright, so as I turn this, I think you can see it a bit better. So I'm just blending down those hills and valleys into, and making sure that it's all connected to the fur underneath it. I don't know if that's going to be clearly seen or not from where you are, but that's what I'm doing. And as you go with the tools, it's just seeing where it looks, where creatively you want the hair to flow, and you can push it in that direction. So this hand is so in the way. I wish I didn't put the hand on yet. I'm going to see how far I can get before I cut that hand off. Hopefully I don't have to. All right, and now I'm just making sure it's flowing into the hair going in the other direction. Like the hair that was already on his neck, the back of his neck. All right, and this is where the strands start coming in. I want to press down and curve here and there around those tendrils so that you still see kind of a sharpness on one side or the other of how the hair rolls. You know, so you've got little valleys in there. All right, and that's going to blend into the hair that I already had here too. when you're casting something, like I can't make the hair kind of like the hair in its head obviously is very different. This still all needs to be reworked up here. Like this has to be like hair has to be twisted, the ends have to be pointed and things, but I can't do that. Like you can't just have every piece of hair standing up on it. So you want to blend it as much as possible. There's a thing in sculpting called undercuts, which this has many undercuts. Undercuts mean that sometimes you have to make a mold of something, and the mold itself is solid, so it has to come apart like a clamshell almost. And if you have undercuts, that means that maybe the clay goes up and then comes back in, so the mold can go up and under that, and it won't pull apart. It'll get stuck. And that's not this type of mold. So I can still go in and make hills and valleys and stuff. Sorry, I'm just fixing this front piece again. You can still make hills and valleys and stuff that goes under, but you don't want to do it to the point where there's these little frail pieces of hair that will ultimately break off. So that's where the next piece comes in. So anyway, so this is all kind of blended a bit better now. Right in there is not. But it still just shapes. Right. Get around this hand. Get in there. Okay. So he still has that silhouette that I carved in there earlier. But now it's flowing into one piece as opposed to being a neck and then a collar. It's fine up at the front here, but I did not like it back here. So so now I will go back in and using the tip of this little curvy tool, start to add like individual hairs in here. First by just pressing and making smaller areas within that clump. But also just feathering out, because it goes from like a clump to strands to a strand to many little strands. So, which is why I have to wear my silly magnifying glasses, because there's you know, it's like when you first saw the sculpture in pictures a couple of weeks ago, and I drew those lines on there of where the hair goes, the direction of it, and people thought that was the hair, which it is not. There's a lot more work to do than that. But, you know, I'm going in, by the time this is done, I will have touched every area on it with the tip of one of these tools to create individual little hairs. So, and sometimes I use the plastic wrap and sometimes I do not. Sometimes you don't need to. I've done it on some of this, but not all of this is my point. So, anyway, now I'm going to turn this around in a second. Hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. So now those individual little areas have their own strands coming off of them. And they're really sharp in some places, and they're not in others, as you can see on this. That's to make it interesting as far as it's the dynamic of how the hairs are moving on it. But then, you know, one of the final steps with this is to use the smoothing agent. So, which I've already used on some of these areas, so they're very dulled down and they're just barely there. And that's because of what the alcohol or the lighter fluid does to it. So let me just get in here and I'll show you some of that too. Not that this is exciting, but hopefully you can see how an hour turns into 8 when you're doing this. It's just super time consuming.